you want me to come up?
Go ahead. I'm going to just stand at the podium. Is this, we're on? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom here at the Hudson Institute. And what an intellectually enlightened, high-octane start to our midterm election week, a most acrimonious midterm period, I should add. We have today a deeply learned historical, philosophical, and cultural discussion of the growing crisis facing American liberty. We have as our guest Os Guinness, and as our interviewer, Walter Russell Mead, who is a distinguished fellow here at Hudson. The discussion is centering on, or the occasion for it is a discussion of Oz's timely new book, published just last month by InterVarsity Press, with a provocative title, Last Call for Liberty, How America's Genius for Freedom Has Become Its Greatest Threat. And one of its main issues is something that concerns me very deeply, which is religious liberty and civic virtue. Europe, as you may have seen 2 weeks ago, the Human Rights Court there decided that protecting feelings overrided, and social peace overrided the freedom to express dissent or criticism of religion in certain cases. And so the question really before us is America, one of the questions, is America headed in the same direction? And our midterm elections, of course, will not settle this, but they will underscore it. Os Guinness has been a longtime friend. He was born in China to British parents. Os has lived and worked in the United States since 1984. He has authored or edited over 30 books over his career of commenting on American civics and society. He was the lead drafter of the Williamsburg Charter in 1988, a celebration of the bicentennial of the US Constitution, and later of the Global Charter of Conscience, which was published at the European Union Parliament in 2012. And interviewing Os will be our own Hudson Distinguished Fellow, the Ravenel B. Curry Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship, who is also a Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College in New York. And before joining Hudson, Mead was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations as the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy. And he, too, has authored numerous books, including the widely recognized Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, published by Alfred A. Knopf in 2004. And Walter has a book in the works now that it's due to be published in 2021, entitled The Ark of a Covenant, the U.S., Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. And I want to also mention both Os and Walter share a common cultural background in the Episcopal or Anglican tradition. Os's parents and grandparents were medical missionaries in China. And he actually lost 2 of his brothers in the famine in China in 1943 during the war there. Walter's own father was an ordained Episcopal priest from the South. He was a leading figure in that church's pastoral guidance, worked to strengthen local congregations, and religious institutions and was a leader in the desegregation movement there. So please join me in welcoming Os Guinness to Hudson today. Thank you. Thank you, Os.
Thank you, Nina. Sure. It's a tremendous privilege for me to be here. I've lived in the US for a number of years now. I must confess, I have never got used to American breakfast meetings. And this is the first time I've been at a think tank with anything at 9 o'clock on a rainy Monday morning. But it's an enormous privilege to be at Hudson. As Nina said, I was born in China and grew up with Americans. But my first visit here was 1968. And for 6 years as a tourist, I crossed from the East Coast to the West Coast, Harvard to Berkeley. I met Mario Savio, who'd led the free speech movement, enjoyed Fillmore West and Slick and the Jefferson Airplane and things like that. And as I look back on that year, 50 years ago this year, people say that America then was actually much more violent, even than today. The two assassinations of Dr. Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and the so-called police riots at the Chicago Convention. But having said that, I would argue that America is more deeply divided, although at the moment it's called a cold civil war. I would argue that America is as deeply divided as at any point since just before the Civil War. But the question is, why? As you know, there are many analyses. One more episode in left against right, the Heartlanders against the coastals, the nationalists and populists against the globalists, and many such descriptions. But I would argue, as a European, that if you look at many of the movements we've seen in the last 50 years, postmodernism, multiculturalism, tribal politics, victim politics, political correctness, and the sexual revolution, and other such movements, actually the deepest division of all is between those whose ideas of the republic, and specifically of freedom, go back to 1776 and the American Revolution, and those whose ideas of the republic and the ideas of freedom actually go back, whether they're aware of it or not, to 1789 and the French Enlightenment and its various heirs, by which I mean people like Friedrich Nietzsche, Antonio Gramsci, Herbert Marcuse, and more recently people like Michel Foucault. In other words, the deep clash is between very different views of the Republic and very, very different views of freedom, and they will come out in very different places. Now, why is that important? The great St. Augustine argued that to really understand a nation, you don't look at the size of its population or the strength of its army, or we would say today the GNP. You look at what it loves supremely. And seen that way, there's no question to anyone that what America loves supremely is freedom. But while freedom is the key to America, the question is, what is the key to freedom? And these two different revolutions have very, very different ideas. You can see how ideas that have come from the liberal left have actually changed over the course of time in very significant ways. You think of how Marx called for basically a class conflict. And following Gramsci and Marcuse, the shift was from a class conflict to a cultural conflict, from the haves and have-nots, essentially to those with power and those considered oppressive. Antonio Gramsci, no books from prison. You've got to win the cultural hegemony. Or 50 years ago this year, Rudi Deutschke. What we need is a long march through the institutions, by which he meant principally universities and colleges, the press and media, and the world of entertainment. And you can see how significantly powerful that long march has been, whether people were powerfully aware of it or not. Now, when I say as deeply divided since just before the Civil War. The great difference then and now is the lack of Lincoln-like vision and leadership. So Lincoln is unabashed in addressing the evils, say, of slavery, but always in the light of the Declaration and what he called the better angels of the American nature. And that's what's missing today. So you have very clear voices on the liberal left, but remarkable lack of clear voices who are representing the revolution with a clear understanding of the importance of the Declaration, addressing the evils that are definitely there in terms of injustices wherever, but in the light of the better angels of the American nature. So as I understand it, America is truly somewhere close to a Rubicon moment. And you remember when Caesar stood before that little rushing torrent in northern Italy, deciding whether or not to cross, it was the moment, as Cicero put it, where the Roman Republic became, and it was the first use of that word, a rhino. Republic in name only, but not Republican in name only, but the Republic in name only. And I would argue that America's close to that point where the question is, will she live true to the founding vision and the founding principles that came down through 1776 and the American Revolution, or will she increasingly shift towards ideas of freedom and the Republic which come down through the French Revolution? Maybe Dr. Martin Luther King was the last one to address the patent evils in the light of the Declaration. As we know, he called the Declaration a promissory note. But as you shift from Martin Luther King, say, to Stokely Carmichael, and then with the rise of the anti-Vietnam movement and feminism and various movements in the 1960s, somewhere around 50 years ago this year, there was that fateful lurch left, and America increasingly seen as chronically racist, sexist, militarist, hegemonic, and all sorts of other rude terms. So even today, with people talking about making America great again, there's often not a deep discussion of what made America great in the first place. So what I've tried to do in my book, if this is correct, is to call for a national conversation, a kind of national town hall debate on what vision of freedom, what vision of the Republic Americans want to go forward with. I know there are some who argue that America has already crossed the threshold of another revolution and there's no going back, and the days of the Republic and of Republican habits of the heart are actually finished. But I would argue that with leadership, it's not over. So I've tried to raise, my book is a series of questions, a checklist, as it were, 10 questions for American citizens to ask, what is your view of the Republic? What is your view of freedom? And where do you hope it'll come out? We don't have the time to go into too many of them, but let me just mention very briefly some of the questions that I think Americans need to ask. The first being, where does your freedom come from? You follow the polls today, the old notion of the ancient liberties of the English, which would have been understood, say, in New England not too long ago, were dismissed along with everything waspish. And now, of course, they'd be repudiated decisively in terms of white privilege. Many of the ideas of the revolution coming from the Paleo-Indians in the Northwest are surely far-fetched and very fanciful. Most Americans would say freedom comes from Athens, democracy. But you know well how your framers were extremely chary, certainly about direct democracy, but even about democracy at large. And the fact is, historically, American freedom comes not from Athens, but from Sinai. And many Americans don't realize how it was the Jewish Hebrew covenant which actually underlies the Constitution. Rich in meaning for society, compared, say, with democracy, which has zero social content, And yet when it comes to the roots of this constitutional covenantal freedom, many Americans don't simply understand it at all. The second question, what do you actually mean by freedom? Abraham Lincoln says in the 1850s, everyone uses the word freedom, but the North means one thing, the South another. And you can see today there are rampantly different views of freedom around, many of which have no basis, and some of which are absolutely unsustainable. Lord Acton's basic distinction still holds good. Is freedom the permission to do what we like, or the power to do what we ought? I was at Oxford with Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish philosopher, and can remember many dinners of his expatiating his idea of freedom is negative and positive. Negative freedom being freedom from, which is basic freedom, preliminary freedom. Anyone under the control of anyone or anything outside themselves is not free, whether it's a bully or a colonial power or drugs, sex, or alcohol. Negative freedom is basic freedom. But, Berlin said, you've got to go from the negative to the positive, from freedom from to freedom for, freedom to be. And that, of course, requires a notion of truth. But in a postmodern, post-truth world, there is little room given to the notion of truth and ideas that give you a positive view of freedom. And much libertarian freedom is incredibly unrealistic in what it's standing for. And we need to have a solid debate, because the framers had a very, very different view of freedom from the one that's come down from the French Revolution. A third question is, have Americans faced the fundamental paradox of freedom? Think of the Korean War Memorial, not far from here. People are inspired at looking at that line on it, freedom is not free. But the paradox of freedom is darker. The greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. But you can see how powerful that is, and one of the main reasons that freedom never lasts. Sometimes it becomes permissiveness and license and anarchy, and then rebounds into authoritarianism. Sometimes freedom-loving people so love safety and security in their freedom that they have so much security, so much surveillance, one nation under surveillance, they're no longer free. Or sometimes freedom-loving people will do anything to fight for freedom, including things that contradict freedom and bring it into disrepute. And there are many, many reasons why freedom undermines itself. And the sobering fact is that free societies are few and fleeting. And yet many people think we're free, it'll last forever. Not at all. And we need to take very seriously how freedom undermines itself and how one needs to have vigilance and transmission in every generation if that freedom is to last. Another great question, and the one that Nina was referring to almost, is how do we guarantee freedom in the exploding diversity of today? There's no question across the world that to do that, you have to have at the core of diverse societies freedom of conscience and respect for freedom of conscience. But you can see that while that's been one of the great secrets of American freedom, for 300 years nearly, people who came here fighting for civil and religious liberty, and yet since RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in '93, in the last 20 years, there's been a bigger sea change on religious freedom than maybe the previous 300 together. And it's happening right in front of this generation, which almost seems to squander its heritage without any serious protest and concern. I call the forces the three dark R's. You can think of what the reducers, those who've taken religious freedom. James Madison's free exercise. The Universal Declaration, Article 18, the right to adopt, to exercise, to change, and to share an incredibly comprehensive understanding of a human right, reduced to freedom of worship. Every dictator grants you freedom of worship. Whatever you want to believe between your two ears, as long as your mouth is firmly shut and you stay in your own home, I grant it to you. That's not American religious freedom and freedom of conscience. And yet, the last president and one of his secretaries of state argued for quite a while for that definition of freedom. Well, the second dark are the removers. Many of the new atheists are quite open about it. It was 9/11 and the ugly face of religion in public life which made them see you've got to remove religion from public life. Now, there had always been those who had a strict understanding of the separation of church and state, but that's grown enormously. So for many people, religious freedom is freedom from religion decisively today in a way that, again, undermines the human right. But the principal dark hour, I think, is the third one. I call them the rebranders. As I said, you go back to the founding and people came to this country. They fought the revolution in the name of civil and religious liberty, the first liberty. But today, a code word for discrimination, for bigotry. And they don't realize they're literally cutting off the branch in which they're sitting, because the very way they've taken religious freedom and rebranded it as bigotry means the right to dissent is undermined, and even the right of conscientious moral objection. Very profound follies, but they're going on apace in our culture with too few people standing against it. Thank God for Hudson and for Nina and Paul Marshall and others here at Hudson who've spoken out and written out so magnificently. One last question, mentioned quickly in passing, and that is, where does freedom come from? In its grounding. If we look in the Torah, the Hebrew scriptures, you can see how unique was their understanding of freedom. Not just let my people go, but the idea of a free God calling a free people to worship him freely, and in the cultural context, highly distinctive. Did the Egyptians have a strong view of liberty? No. Did the Babylonians? No. Everything was under the stars. Did the Greeks ultimately? No. Everything was finally under fate, Moira. But if we look around our modern world philosophically, you can look, say, from Spinoza to Marx to Freud to J.B. Watson to B.F. Skinner to Jacques Monod, right down to our new atheists today like Sam Harris. Is there a grounding for human freedom? No. Sam Harris, the very cover of his book, you have a puppet on strings, and you can see humans are historically or economically or biologically or chemically determined. And Sam Harris says quite bluntly, freedom is a fiction. And you can see that this precious understanding is actually almost unique to the Hebrew and Christian scriptures as providing a basis for freedom. So here we are at this extraordinary moment. Lincoln argued that America cannot stay half slave, half free. A house divided cannot stand. And I would argue America cannot stay half 1776 and half 1789. You have two very different views of the Republic, and you have two very different views of freedom. And they will play themselves out. You can see they are with the crisis of free speech and many other things in this country. So we're approaching the Rubicon moment. It's relatively easy to see what has to be done, but much harder to do it. Above all, there needs to be leadership. I was in Philadelphia a couple of weeks ago and always moved to go there. Think of Abraham Lincoln coming from Springfield to Washington through Philadelphia, and he gives two speeches in February 1861 on his way to becoming president here. One of them off the cuff and the other almost so, but in both of them he says all his ideas came from the Declaration, which came from that building. And in one of the speeches he finishes by quoting Psalm 137. May my right hand forget its cunning, and may my mouth cleave to the roof of my my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I forget and am unfaithful to these teachings. Where are the leaders today who will address the present situation, who will look at the present problems, who will address the present injustices, but all in the light of the better angels of the American nature and in light of all that was promised in the Declaration? We need leaders with a sense of history. Walter and I were talking earlier. As a teenager, I had the privilege of meeting Winston Churchill. But growing up with Churchill as the prime minister of my boyhood, there was hardly a speech that he gave where his historical vision didn't season everything he was saying. And that's one of the missing things I miss here living in America, how few are able to grasp any powerful sense of history in addressing today's problems. We need leaders with vision, with courage, and with a great historical perspective who believe in the Declaration and the better angels and address the present situation. I think, secondly, we need a restoration of the American first principles, the unum. E pluribus unum. In the 19th century, people could have written on a piece of paper 6, 10, 12 of what they believe were the uniting first principles. I often ask whether CEOs or college students today get a piece of paper and write down what you think is the unum. And hardly anyone get beyond 1 or 2. And you can see that civic education has collapsed in the public schools, which were once not just free universal education, but free universal education that taught the first things of the American experiment. And that's gone, which means the whole notion of transmission. Again, as our Jewish friends put it, what did Moses speak about the night of the Passover? Hundreds of years of slavery, and tonight they're going free. What did he speak about? Freedom? No. The promised land of milk and honey? No. The howling desert they were going to have to face? No. He talked about 3 times children. Children. As the Jews point out, schooling, the transmission from parents to children, from teachers to students, is more important to a faith community and to a free society even than its military. And merely to beef up the military and the economy will never make America great again unless there's a restoration of the ideas that made this country as a nation by intention and by ideas, which of course means, and I mentioned the third thing, leadership, civic education, and the third thing, the freedom for freedoms. The great scholar Daniel Elazar, who put the notion of covenantalism back on the map, wrote many books and many articles, but in one of the last ones he made the simple remark that the notion of covenant comes from the Middle East, obviously, in cultures where you have oases. And he said, think of an oasis. No oasis is larger or more luxuriant, and above all, longer lasting than one thing, the wellspring at its heart. And if there's a cutting off of the wellspring, the death of the oasis. And in the same way, he said, at the bottom of everything, you have to have notions of freedom and of faith underlying the freedom, which is the wellspring of a free republic, and nothing else will do. So my question to Americans today is we've got to have people who analyze the situation rightly, but then leaders who will call the nation back, not turning this particular division into one more round of the culture wars, but rather seeing the deep division between 1776 and 1789, but transcending it and calling Americans back to a better way, not only of the past, but hopefully of the future too.
Thank you. Well, that was the irrepressible Os Guinness, and we're very lucky that even on a cold, dark, getting darker Monday morning, Oz is able to bring some life and light into our midst here at Hudson. And I do want to say that thanks to Nina and Paul, Hudson has a tradition among think tanks almost unique in Washington of placing questions of religious liberty at the center of our work. And this is something I hope we will continue. I want to thank Anne Marie Hauser for helping us to organize this event, and we hope we will continue to explore this vital dimension of national and international life. Oz, one thing that struck me listening to your talk was that there's this kind of tension. On the one hand, you see the United States, America, in the midst of a really fundamental struggle between opposed principles, in some ways comparable to the struggle between slavery and freedom in the crisis leading up to the Civil War. But at the same time, you stress the idea of unity and reconciliation as being somehow key to where do we go. So how does a leader sort of manage the tension in these principles? On the one hand, of sharpening differences, making clear the fundamental opposition that we're dealing with, and yet at the same time building bridges.
Well, I think much of the espousal, say the liberal left, some of it's witting, and a great deal is unwitting. And equally, if you come to those who want to defend the American Revolution, people have instinctively the right ideas, but they don't realize how much you need an articulated description of it. So a question I have to myself, if you had a Lincoln-like leader today, you and I were discussing sort of candidates for that earlier, we won't mention names, would it have resonance? And I know scholars, you think of Angelo Codevilla down in Claremont, who argues the habits of the heart have gone. They are so eroded that the republic simply could not be restored. No, I don't think things are that bad. And my question would be, if you had leader, if you had vision, would it have resonance to waken people on both sides? But it would have to be reconciling. In other words, that's what I meant by the danger of saying 1776 against 1789, one more round of banging each other. Mm-hmm. That would be a disaster. You've got to have people who call back to the best of the American Revolution by appealing to people across the spectrum.
It's interesting to me when I contrast the situation in the U.S. today with, say, 25 or 50 years ago. There's sort of three big differences that I can see. One is that the Catholic Church, which 50 years ago was a self-confident, powerful organization with strong networks of religious communities and schools, while it did not originate in the 1776 atmosphere, the Catholic Church goes back a good deal further than that, nevertheless, over a period of 200 years of engagement with American society, American Catholicism had developed a kind of a synthesis. And the concept of individual freedom that Catholics experience in the U.S. went on in Vatican II to have a real impact on Catholic teaching worldwide. At the same time, you had the mainline Protestant churches who were producing still, or at least containing still, figures like Reinhold Niebuhr, and who had given an element of deep Christian reflection to the highest levels of American life, and even people who weren't religious, like Arthur Schlesinger, at one point formed the group Atheists for Niebuhr. So there was this sort of cultural and intellectual influence, and then among evangelicals, you had the voice of Billy Graham, someone who was really, I think you have to go back almost to Jonathan Edwards and Whitefield and some of the other 18th century evangelists to find an individual who had this kind of power to voice a religious message and align it in some ways with these principles of 1776. Now, it looks to me today as if all three of these traditions are lacking the leadership and the focus that we would have seen. What can be done about that? Can anything be done?
I hope so. No, I agree with that. Catholic friends have their crisis with the sexual abuse. The mainline denominations have lost so much of their orthodoxy, and the evangelicals have gone off into a politicized version of the faith, which is disastrous. I would say the scandal of the American church, this is one country in the West where Christians are a huge majority, and yet tiny groups have much more cultural influence than they do. So wonderful groups. You can see how strongly I'm supportive of the Jewish community. 2% of America, but they punch well above their weight intellectually, financially, and in other areas too. Or groups that I personally would disagree with, like, say, the LGBT extremists. Tiny group, but incredible influence. So we need a reformation and renewal within the Christian community to come out with a really constructive position. Again, but we still have the numbers. Shame on us that we're so pathetic today. But you're right, it needs to be with a renewal and a reformation in the Christian community.
Well, we're going to go a little bit longer than originally planned since it was difficult for a lot of us to get here this morning. I understand the trains. Amazingly, the Washington Metro doesn't always perform at peak when the weather is bad. That's kind of shocking, really, but there it is. So we have a little bit more time, but I do want to get to some questions from the audience for Dr. Guinness. Yes? Could you please introduce yourself and wait for the microphone, too? Thank you.
Milton Grenfell. Mr. Guinness, your point about the miseducation of the youth, I think, is fundamental. The idea of some sort of renaissance in America, going back to first principles, is very difficult when they don't know what you're talking about. I mean, it seems like you'd have to throw out all the textbooks going back to maybe the mid-'60s, because as soon as the textbooks took out the heroic narrative content and replaced it with somehow impersonal forces that are, first, I don't think entirely true. The great man theory does hold water, I think, when looked at closely. But secondly, it's not interesting. And so the kids just blow off history, and you can't bring them back to a history they don't know. What sort of radical project could we practically launch that would get history back to being a true history?
No, that's a huge question. When I went to school, I didn't realize how rare it was where my headmaster taught Pericles or Rome or whatever, like he taught Winston Churchill. And it was all a living history. And I was saying often, school in the late 50s, we would read 5 newspapers a day. And now I look at my son and his, when he was 10, he read all the Tolkien. Now he's in his mid-30s. It's the social media and the internet and books, not so much. And you can see there's 100 factors which have undermined this. But thank God for the good schools that are there, but eventually it won't touch America until it comes back into the public schools, and that means overcoming tremendous resistance in the teachers' unions and so on. No, not surprisingly, education is the graveyard of American idealists. But that is one of the crucial areas. But we should never give up. Never give up. We've got to look at all the problems. I mean, I mentioned the social media. That's added to it enormously. How do you get people to have a good, balanced digest of information and wisdom and to think critically? It's harder than ever in this crazy world in which we're living. But that's one of the key areas, I agree. I'm not an educationalist, but that's incredibly important.
But you are a bit of an educator, I think. That's what one does.
The universities, though, are the finishing schools of America. And they're terrible.
Other questions? Because I've got plenty more, but I did want to give you a chance, but now that you've proven unworthy, I'm going to go back. When you think of, our current situation where the two parties are more polarized than ever before, but neither really is embodying very successfully this American tradition, that's your Anglo-American tradition, I think we can call it, that you're speaking of. How do we think about politics? This is the day before a midterm election.
Well, the trouble is, if you start going into some of this, much of the Republican Party became more establishment and settled on its power than really driven by those ideas, and that's part of the problem. So it's not that one side's this and one side's the good side and the other side's the bad side. There are problems to be shared on all sides, and we need leaders like that. So I don't think tomorrow is going to settle this. It will reveal a lot. Put it one way, the greatest danger would be, I'm talking shorthand, 1789, we'll just call it that. 1789 broke out more in the last presidency than ever before. And then you could see the second stage was in the so-called resistance. I mean, we have in England the word loyal opposition. Mm-hmm. The resistance is the refusal to take the election seriously and the determined attempt to undermine the legitimacy of those who were duly elected. That's incredibly fateful for democracy. Now, if there were then a third stage, which would be a reaction to the reaction, that would drive the spiral even deeper. Mm-hmm. One of the things I had in my book, which the editors cut out, I had a section, sort of René Girard style, when words break down, conflict and violence are never far away. God forbid that we have an assassination of a political leader. But you could see this spiraling down even further. So tomorrow won't settle anything, but it will reveal a lot.
When I try to look for hopeful things, one of the things I do see is the Federalist Society, which to some degree I think is organized around these principles, these 1776 principles, and the idea that our courts should be, the court decisions should be grounded in this. And this is an example of a movement that in some ways imitated the left. The long march through institutions has created a minority, but a very effective minority of thinkers and writers and students in the legal community. Does that provide a model for activism in other fields of life, do you think?
Well, there are all sorts of magnificent exceptions. Hudson itself, the Federalist Society, colleges like, say, Hillsdale, things like that. There are all sorts of magnificent exceptions, but there's still that lack of a leader at the highest level, as it were, to give voice to all of them together and call the nation back, even those, you think how the Federalist Society is dismissed by its enemies, just as one more part of the culture war. No, it's not. It's something deeply American, but a leader has to articulate how that is so and bring together all these magnificent exceptions and give voice to them.
See a question?
Mr. Guinness, John Sidolides.
Yes.
Thank you. You are calling, if I hear you correctly, for a national debate about
Conversation. Town hall, then.
The segment of American society that is based on the 1776 first principles may feel it's on the losing side of the trends of the last half century. The side that is with the 1789 principles and philosophical concepts may feel it's on the march. Why would the 1789 segment agree to a conversation when they have had all the momentum behind them for the last 50 years? They'll say they're winning.
Mm-hmm. No, the extremists won't. They simply won't. But I find, that's why I said, many people are unwittingly on that side, because the universities are, or whatever. They're unwittingly. They really don't realize the situation. We're very like to put this in biblical terms when the prophet Elijah, confronted the prophets of Baal and so on, the royal family on that side. The people were sitting on the fence, as he says. And a lot of people today, they're unwitting supporters of this, that, and the other, because they're party members here or whatever it is. And we've got to articulate where these things are leading to and drive people to the logic of their conclusions. Do they see? I mean, if you look, the English Revolution, which failed, and the American Revolution, which succeeded, both of those owe everything to the Torah. But the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, they are very, very different. And we've got to really help people understand. You can't just say revolution, and you can't just say freedom. Where does this particular view of freedom lead to? All of those produced reigns of terror, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see today wherever these ideas on, I'm calling it 1789, but owes a lot to Nietzsche and all these others too. You know, wherever it's predominated, it has finished freedom off and led to Rousseau-style people being forced to be free and so on. So you need powerful persuasion.
I support the concept of the conversation. The question is, how do we get there?
Well, I mean, wherever, you know, our neighbors, the community we live in. So wherever I am, I like to debate people, but not just people in my echo chamber or whatever, but whoever's there, let's debate them.
Yes.
In other
Bring
words,
the microphone
to
around.
me, looking down through history, freedom is very rare and very precious. And people who play irresponsibly with freedom, we're free, we'll always be free, they're foolish. Do you realize what a rare, fragile flower it is? And it requires certain things to sustain it. And if you don't have those things, it ends up this way or that way. We've got to get people to see the significance of this generation, which is in danger of throwing it all away.
Sure.
My name is Carlos Avillon. I'm an economist, and to address the gentleman's question, how does a nation of 320 million get to the idea you are proposing? I was wondering if the way is with fast economic growth, because I was thinking in the history of this country from 1869 to 1912, the Republican Party won just about every single election with the exception of one, and that coincided with a rate of economic growth which was of about 6% annually, the fastest sustained rate of growth in the history of this country. And I'm also thinking in Singapore that since its founding more than 50 years ago, every single election has been won by the People's Actions Party of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, coinciding with spectacular rates of growth, and therefore the population is extremely pleased with that party and follows that party. So would that be the way towards decreasing this growing intensity of which could lead to extreme levels of violence, like you correctly said? Would that be the way? Because through history, that seems to be a way of appeasing a whole population.
Well, certainly in times of growth and prosperity, people are happier, and thus you have the checkbook response in elections. But I think we have a problem, though, and that is capitalism is the greatest engine of wealth creation in history. But capitalism without ethics produces incredible inequalities, which lead to injustice, which lead to a refueling of the things like redistribution, socialism, Marxism, etc. And it's no accident that's how Marx himself arose. Now, if you look, say, at the differential between American workers and American CEOs, the Europeans are shocked by the levels here. But then you look at what is predicted when we have artificial superintelligence. Take the first chapter of Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, when the modern differentials will look puny by comparison with the future Jeff Bezoses and so on. In other words, the inequalities are incredible. Capitalism's got to consider the place of ethics and generosity and human values, so it will never be just capitalism alone. And I think that's one mistake of our current president. You can't make America great again by the economy alone or by the military alone. America's a nation by intention and by ideas, and if those don't thrive, some of the other problems will come in. Now, we've got to say, there are immense challenges, say, for democracy. I mean, Bertrand Russell, whom I had as a student when I was a boy, as a student at London, he would argue, as your framers did, it's a challenge to produce a lasting democracy. It's a challenge to produce a large democracy. So Russell would say, if there are 20 million Englishmen, I have a 20 millionth share in the government. But I only have a 20 millionth share in the government of myself, so I feel more governed than governing. Now, when you have 300 million, you start to see some of the problems of democracy. So the 19th century, they said, as we grow in population, so suffrage grows, so education grows. But you're going back to the poor education. So you have people who are not educated sufficiently to be wise citizens, and so on. So there are incredible challenges for democracy and for republicanism, the small r. But I personally don't think the economy alone will do it. It'll keep people contented for a while, but it creates its own problems in many areas. The problem's much deeper than just the free market by itself.
So you're saying the golden calf is not enough?
In essence.
Unfortunately, okay, yes.
So, Joseph Skolderberg, so you've kind of touched on injustice a few times. It seems like it's very difficult to even have a conversation on what is injustice these days and not in our society. Just your thoughts on that, that as a word and as a concept, and how we actually have a conversation around that.
Well, I think we've got to have those discussions. Put it this way. There are some notions, take human dignity, that's almost unique to the Hebrew Scriptures. You don't find it elsewhere. Humans have a unique dignity, made precious, inalienable, etc., in the image and likeness of God. When you come to justice, it's not unique, there are overlapping views. So even take the two differences I made. 1776 sees it one way, 1789 quite another way. We've got to discuss those differences because they're very important. For example, read Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, up from slavery, rural Virginia, hates slavery. But he says, no one will ever make me hate another man, and I will never have prejudice in my heart, always forgiveness. Now, his view of fighting injustice, same as Martin Luther King, it came out of the Bible. You have the addressing of power, you have the possibility of repentance, you have the possibility of forgiveness, which means the past can be cut off, the present can be opened up. That's a whole biblical understanding of justice. Now you look at the liberal left justice, reparations, resentment, revenge. Booker T. Washington actually says there are people in his day who didn't want, quote, the Negro to lose their grievances, I'm quoting, because they didn't want to lose their jobs. And you can see people today whose business is to stoke injustice even as they address it. So we've got to say justice, can't just use the word. Whose justice, which justice, and where does it lead? And many of the views on justice take, say, Nietzsche's views of resentment. They're a disaster. And we've got to push them out through debate to people to see that way is a disaster. Now, there are injustices. There's no easy answers anywhere. You take, say, I don't want to wade into the kneeling controversy. Martin Luther King talked to the promissory note. Great speech on them all. Kaepernick disrespects the standard. That's the difference. No, he's not appealing to the flag, the pledge. the Declaration as the standard, the source of the promissory note by which you judge the injustice, he's actually, without realizing it probably, referring to another revolution and disrespecting the source of this one. Who makes that point? No. And it's hardly any of the current controversies are expressed in terms of first principles. So I've lived here 30 years. You take, say, immigration. We hear of the wall or sanctuary cities. Hardly ever an understanding of immigration and what it really means in terms of citizenship and civic education and so on and so on. And all these issues, Kaepernick or the wall, they all need to be discussed at far deeper levels that are profoundly American.
Well, you're making me think that we need to do a bit more to educate ourselves in these principles, and maybe some of us could form reading groups or other things where we try to study these. And because there's an interesting dynamic. You can't have a leader without a public that's ready to hear.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And so how do we, unless someone here feels called to be that leader that we are looking for, maybe for many of us here, the job is to try to prepare the way, be more John the Baptists, perhaps, than... In any case, I think we all want to thank Oz for a terrific exposition. I understand that copies of his latest book are for sale in the behind this room. They take credit cards, so you have no real excuse. And I understand also that he might be, he's agreed to kind of be with us for a few minutes after the formal event to carry on the discussion. And also perhaps he could be induced to sign a book if people have bought them. Anyway, thanks again.
Also, let me thank Hudson too, and particularly Nina and Paul and others who've made such an incredible stand on these issues.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.